Hello and welcome to the third session in our Practical Digital Preservation Training and Education series. Despite what GoToWebinar thinks that I'm David Portman, I'm actually Sean McGauley from the Preservica team. I'm excited to be here with you today. We have a wonderful lineup prepared for you. We're going to dig into building the business case for digital preservation. We'll get started in just a few minutes. We're going to give folks a little bit extra time just to log in. In the meantime, please feel to say hello in the chat, share where you're tuning in from. I'm tuning in from the Boston area of Massachusetts. We're having a bit of a heat wave today. We're supposed to get up into the 90s. I was just outside with my dogs walking before this, and it is hot, so I'm glad to be here in the AC. So please say hi, and we'll be getting started very soon. Thank you.
Welcome. So glad to have you today. We are in session 3, as Sean said, building the business case of our Practical Digital Preservation Training and Education series. So we'll go ahead and get started, and people can join us as they come on. And if you come late or miss this session, of course, everything's being recorded. And so you will be able to catch up in good time. So let's see. Let me see if I can advance the slide here. Come on. Don't seem to be getting it, Sean. Can you just make sure that I have control? Or go ahead and flip to the next slide. There we go. So I'm Lori Ashley. I've forgotten to turn my camera on the last couple of times, but here you can see I look pretty much like my picture. I'm with Turnsell Consulting. I'm an independent consultant now, but I was with Preservica for 4 years, and I'm considered still a friend of the family. I was asked to facilitate this session, and I'm so delighted to be here and to connect with you and to share a little bit of my experience along the way. So coming up in this session today, we're going to let you know who's on the roster for speaking. It's a great program. I'm going to cover a couple of highlights of building a business case for digital preservation. I've been in this space for almost 20 years now, and I've had a lot of exposure to the challenges and opportunities that archivists and records management professionals are facing. And I've had the privilege of participating in a number of business cases and assessments over the years. So I hope to add something of use that you can take away. Then we're going to have a couple of presentations. We're going to be joined by Kyle Bronis of Library and Archives Canada, and Rachel Onif, who's with the Vermont Historical Program, along with a short training session by Paul Clark on access the public portal, just a few tweaks and twists and turns in the starter product that you can use. And then we'll open it up to Q&A, which we welcome you to post in the questions along the way. And then just a quick wrap up with some tools and resources that we'll be providing, and then a reminder of the last session that's coming up. I'm going to turn off my camera now so I don't distract myself and move forward with the program. Let's see, I'm still not getting, there we go. So first of all, before we move on, we want to thank ARMA Canada and the Association of Canadian Archivists for supporting this training session by letting you know that it was happening. We're so glad to have their cooperation and collaboration because they are the associations that are representing the very best of Canadian records managers and archivists. So we're delighted and glad that you could be joining us. Gosh, I'm really sticky today. I'm sorry, this doesn't seem to be advancing. Okay, so before we get started, like we did last time, I'm going to call on Aubrey Shanahan, who's the onboarding specialist for Preservica, to just hit a couple of highlights before we get started, and then Aubrey will be back with us for the Q&A, and of course she's always out there in the virtual space, ready to talk about Starter and all things digital preservation. So take it away, Aubrey.
Thanks, Lori. So first thing I just wanted to kind of start off with is we've received a little bit of feedback about why this training series is so heavily focused, particularly on Starter, and we wanted to address that. Digital preservation requires the integration of people, processes, and technologies, and most organizations are still on their journey to secure resources and build out those capabilities to mitigate the impacts of technology obsolescence on their valued digital content. Over the years, Preservica has heard from hundreds of practitioners that digital preservation technology is too expensive and out of reach, especially for smaller institutions. And because Preservica's mission is to protect and preserve the world's collective digital memory, the decision was made in 2019 to develop a free entry-level product in the hope that it would open a door for practitioners to get hands-on experience with state-of-the-art technology, provide an easy-to-use, trusted repository for at-risk digital collections, and enable outreach to stakeholders and access for users. Starter makes this end-to-end preservation accessible to the smallest family archive by leveraging the same technology used by some of the world's biggest archives. It's not only preservation, it is access, essentially a one-stop shop for housing your digital archive and delivering those valuable assets to your community. I personally will always be an archivist at heart, and I joined Preservica because I truly believe in making digital preservation accessible for all in a responsible and standard-based way. The best part about Starter 2 is that we listen to your feedback. So if you give it a try, test it out, get some files in there, get a feel for the product. We want to hear your feedback about that experience. You are the archives and records management professionals, and we care about your input. We'll do our best to take that feedback and put it into the product wherever possible. With Starter, you've got the opportunity to shape digital preservation practices for the better, and I think that's a super worthy cause. So all that being said, we hope that you're, testing out Starter, getting a feel for the product. We do invite you still to join us on the Community Hub. We have that special group for this Canadian training. So feel free to go in there, check it out, ask questions. We're all monitoring that space and ready to help you with anything that you're working on. And as always, as Laura mentioned, I am always here for questions, comments, and concerns. You can reach out to me via email or on the Community Hub. I am here to help. And I'll hand it back over to Lori.
Thanks, Aubrey. Next slide here. I don't seem to have control, Sean, so if you can go ahead and advance this slide, that'd be great. So as I mentioned, we have a couple of speakers today. We have Kyle and Rachel live in person from Canada. I don't know exactly where you are, Kyle, and then Rachel is in Vermont. And then Paul is going to be joining us via recording today, but he did a cleanup on something he had done, and he's got lots of information to share. So you'll hear from all these folks, and then you'll hear again from Aubrey and myself. Okay, so moving on, just to give you some context, next slide, please. We are in session 3 of 4. Oops. There we go. Building the business case. So we know whether you're a small institution or a large institution, asking for the resources, demonstrating your value, connecting to the folks who contribute content, reaching out to users, making the case is something that you do every year. And in the public sector, we know sometimes those budgeting cycles are longer, and it takes quite a long time to get the resources that you need. So we want to talk about some tools and a couple of highlights to support you in the work that we know you do, which is to articulate the business case for the resources that you need to do preservation for all of your collections and resources, not just the digital, but of course we're focusing on what it takes to do digital preservation these days. So we're going to hear from practitioners, real people who have gone through the business planning process, who in Rachel's case are helping lots of other institutions and public sector folks make the case and build their capacity. And hopefully that will be useful to you wherever you are in the cycle of building your digital preservation capabilities. Our final session will take place on the 18th, and we'll talk a little bit about what's coming in the future, how Preservica is preparing for all the changes that technology brings to us all, and then do a wrap up. So as Aubrey said, we hope that you're taking the opportunity to try out Starter, whether it's just for a short lark, whether it's your personal papers or you're using some of the assets from your collection. It's fun, it's a beautiful product, and it shows what digital preservation technology is all about. So we hope you're getting some benefit from that. Okay, moving on. Go ahead and advance for me, Sean. Thank you. So a couple of points we want to make today is just, how do archival programs and records management programs fit within the enterprise? Give you a couple of tools. I'm going to share an assessment tool that I had something to do with, and then Preservica has a great little tool that you can use for risk management. Paul's going to talk about managing user access. You've seen in the previous sessions that there's a private-public switch, and he wants to give you a little bit of insight and some tips for how you can best use that. And then we're going to hear from our speakers about what they've done to help build the case, to raise awareness, to educate and advocate for the resources that you and others need to do digital preservation, along with all the other essential work that you do. Okay, moving on. So of course, the archival and records management practices and domains fit within the broader context of your enterprise, and that might be whole of government. It might be a small cultural heritage institution. It might be a large or small corporation. So part of the process of building the business case is demonstrating value, the value of the work that you do, the collections that you protect, the appraisal and scheduling work that you do to surface the value and the need for retention and disposition. Along with that comes, of course, a huge challenge of getting funding, and that typically happens in cycles. And so, of course, a digital archive with permanent assets in it is something that has to be sustained infinitely into the future. And so I have here sustainable funding, because naturally, as your success grows with building a digital archive, it will grow as well. And you will need additional resources in terms of storage, perhaps technical expertise, processing power, all those sorts of things. And so funding is always an issue. Many archives use grant funding, which is great, but it's short term. And so we want to focus on some of the ways, and I hope that Kyle especially can talk about how do you keep that churn going and build that expectation and understanding of what the digital archive needs to be sustained. And then, of course, there's always planning. There's new technology coming at us all the time. And I think as folks get successful in building out their digital archive, you'll see more and more of the records producers and the donors coming to the table when they can see what you can do, how readily their assets can be made available online and preserved digitally. Then it tends to grow by leaps and bounds. And I hope that will happen for all of you. Okay, so a couple of the primary use cases, next slide please, that we see for digital archives, of course, are records archiving and preservation. So whether that's on the record side of the house or whether the transfer has happened to an archival institution, there's preservation that needs to happen. It's been done in paper, it's been done in microfilm, it's been done online, all over time, but we're entering a new phase where some content is only created digitally, and in order to render it and have it accessible in the future, of course, you need technology. These are machine readable assets, and so we have to have the technology that enables us to render them for users when they want. Another primary use case is automated content harvesting. We see this in social media and websites. It's been happening for a good long time in public sector, where producers are posting things out there and you just want to capture them. You don't want to bother them or make them have an after act of preservation. You want to go out there and harvest the content, sometimes in real time through the COVID period, and then take preservation action on it. And then we're seeing a lot of action in application decommissioning, especially with the coming of Microsoft 365 and that rapid adoption, which has been fueled by the pandemic. And so there's a lot of application decommissioning, Lotus Notes, other things. Some of that content's moving into Microsoft 365. Some of it needs to go to a repository, and it's a big use case for what do we do with this stuff that has to be retained when we're ready to retire an application. So all that might be in the mix of you building a business case for what's coming at you that you need to preserve electronically. So next slide, please. So making a business case means you have to demonstrate and understand the value of your content, which of course you do as practitioners and professionals. You also may find it very useful to identify the risk to your collections. And one of the tools that I'll share with you in just a moment will help you do that. And then the last tool that I'll share with you is an assessment model, because what it does is if you're able to look at your digital preservation capabilities, you're able to demonstrate that there are gaps in what you need to do. And those gaps are the things that you want to present in your business plan that you want to fill. And so making the case for the resources and capabilities you need are a combination of the value of your content, the risk that you're needing to mitigate, and the gap that you need to fill with the maturing of your capabilities to preserve. Okay, next slide, please. So if any of you are fans of the ISO standards, which I am, I'll raise my hand and attribute myself to that. One of the things I really liked about the update in 2016 to the ISO 1549, that's the records management standard, was a big section on appraisal, which is so very important and so very core to the records management and archiving domains and disciplines. It is an invaluable service that records managers and archivists provide to their enterprises to help articulate the value by determining what information assets are being created, how are they being captured, where are they being captured, and how long they need to be kept. And of course, this means that you oftentimes have a broad and in some areas very deep understanding of the nature of the business and all those things that come along with it, which is its legal, regulatory, compliance, operational, resource, and technological setting. I think where there's been a gap is we don't always understand where the producers are making the electronic records, and that can create some challenges down the road. But the typical way that we articulate what we know of the value of assets to an organization is through retention scheduling. And oftentimes, there's a part there where the archivists get to raise their hand and say, we would like this to come to the archives when it's done its active life in the operational side. And I think that it's a very, very important tool that the organization uses, and it's a way of them seeing what the value of those assets are later on in the life cycle, whether that's still in the inactive use on the record side or over on the archival side. So this is a very, very important function that you do, and it underpins what you understand are the value of the information assets to your organization. Okay, so moving on, depending on what kind of organization you are in, that articulation of the value may take a lot of different forms. You're going to need digital preservation technology and tools regardless of what kind of institution or the scale of your operation, because there's no way to manage machine readable assets without technology, right? You can't re-render them so users can use them. So if we think about these sort of major categories of users, if you go ahead, you're going to click a couple times here, Sean. So what you're arguing for, you're presenting a business case for, is that we need to make sure that we can take all the steps across the life cycle for as long as this content needs to be retained and safeguarded over decades. And that requires that we have the means to make it readable and usable without having to rely on the application that was used to originate it. So then if we kind of go around the circle here and we look at the various business cases, in the government sector, you've got mandates to preserve the records for the citizens. You've got records requests, so you need to go out and find records and demonstrate accountability and transparency of government operations and use of citizen funds. Up in the corporate realm, you may be protecting the value of your brand or the innovations that your company comes up with, and you want to connect your employees to that heritage, to drive their creativity and to make sure those assets are protected. In the academic world, of course, it's access all the time. You want to make these incredible collections, maybe special collections, it may be collections from your own faculty. You want to make them available for students and researchers. And then you want to reduce the reliance on applications which you're using. Probably your content is spread in a couple different places that may not have all the preservation bells and whistles that you need. On the culture and heritage side, of course, there's often very tight resources and amazingly valuable and incredible assets. Many loan arrangers, and they have to split their time and do a lot of different tasks. And so this technology can help that processing and help efficiency and get more done in less time. And then oftentimes archivists don't have as much IT support as they might like, or maybe they would like to keep IT out of their business. It all depends. And so sometimes looking for a digital preservation solution is something that I can use and work with, which doesn't require me to access my own IT staff because they're just too busy on other aspects of the business. So these are different examples of what might be the use case and the driver of the value in your organization that you want to present in your business plan. Okay, so along with that value, why do we do this? What does preservation bring to the organization? How do I help to protect what's most important to us in our heritage and our culture? Is this problem of digital fragility that we've talked about in other sessions. So we know lots of things are changing. There's lots of different technology vendors which are controlling when things are available. So on the ephemeral digital media side, of course, websites and intranet, social media is always in flux. And then other applications where you might have put content in order to make it accessible. Collaboration is the nature of how we get things done. And so there's a lot of content sitting in shared drives now, Microsoft 365 or SharePoint, in email systems, in DAM systems or content management systems, which are typically backed up and stored, right? But that's not necessarily preservation. And then you've got things that just have long-term use. They can come out of any system in your organization, and they need to be prepared to deal with the technology and file format obsolescence that we just know is going to happen. And so this issue of risk is another component of business planning and asking for resources because you want to mitigate this risk. So in the next two slides, there's a great little tool that Preservica developed a number of years ago. I presented on it at ARMA years ago. So it's been out there, and you're welcome to use it. It comes across as a zip, and it's a spreadsheet. It's super, super easy to use. But basically, it's a digital value at risk calculator. And so it's got these built-in categories, and you fill out the risk matrix for, you pick a type of record. So maybe I'm the Department of Transportation, and I've got infrastructure records or as-built drawings. And so you list a number of different types of information. You talk about how much of that content you have, what the retention period is. There's some built-in drop-downs which have risk factors and consequences, and you select those for each of the types of categories of content that you've put into the risk matrix. If you go to the next slide, Sean, what happens is that it generates a graphic, and it basically is demonstrating the impact of digital loss, high or low, and the risk of digital loss on this chart. And you can see by the colors, it's sort of, the flame up in the upper right-hand corner signals this is probably not an acceptable amount of risk. So those little dots that you see are representations of each type of content that you've loaded in there, and where it falls on the chart is based on which of the risks and loss consequences that you've picked. And what it can do is help to demonstrate that we have some issues. We need to take action to protect the content. And then if you go and speak to stakeholders, demonstrate that their content, the content they care about to do their work or access in the future, is potentially at risk. It can help motivate and build your business case based on this risk. And I know fear and risk is not the best way we want to present ourselves, but it is a factor in digital preservation and in digital assets. And so you can use it as part of your business planning process. So you can generate this profile. And even just looking at the risks and the consequences will, I think, be informative and useful to you. So the link is there, but we will also put the link into the resources on the Community Hub along with the recording of this session. So moving on, I'm going to share something which is another way to go at looking at building a business case. So a number of years ago, I worked with Dr. Charles Dollar, who some of you who are graduates of the University of British Columbia might know. Charles spent a few years there as an instructor, but he spent most of his career at the U.S. National Archives and was director of the first machine-readable records program. So you can see that he wears his age well, but he's been in this thing since the late 1960s. And he brought me into a little project that he was working on. And together we finished out a digital preservation capability maturity model. And go ahead, Sean, click. There's a couple of other pictures that come up. And this is basically, it's a tool. A capability model is something, go ahead and click 2 more times. It has a model built in which has some levels of maturity and capability. That's what you see in the bottom left-hand corner. And we, working with the Council of State Archivists in 2011, we developed a self-assessment tool. So basically you go in and thinking about your organization and the resources that you have to protect, you walk through and you say, do we have a digital preservation policy, a strategy, a governance? Do we have a collaboration and governance set up? Do we have the technical expertise we need? Do we understand what's coming at us, what's going to fall on our plate to be preserved? And then the center and the lower part is all about the services that are provided by a repository, storage, preservation metadata, security, integrity, those sorts of things. So we developed this as a way of what Aubrey said, practitioners are always struggling with making the case, finding the resources. And Charles and I heard that over and over again in our consulting work. And so using the core functionalities and requirements of ISO 14721 and 16363, we came up with this simplified model. And when you go through the self-assessment, you come out with a scorecard, and you can see in the bottom in the center there an example of a scorecard, and it comes out with colors. So red is matched to the nominal ability to preserve digital electronic records, let's say, and then you move up to minimal, and then intermediate, and advanced, and optimal. And so what happens when you get this scorecard is that you gather people around and you have a conversation about where are we, and you can say we don't have a policy. Well, that's a good place to start. We need to articulate that so other people can see what needs to be done. And so technology is only a part of it. There are many other components that relate to that people process part that Aubrey talked about, but we developed this tool to try to get people to move forward. And so there is a self-assessment tool that's available. It's free and public. I run it. I don't share the data with anyone. And it's been used by about 300 different organizations in the world. This model has also been used 3 cycles now by the Council of U.S. State Archivists, and I'll share with you at the end how you can learn more about their effort. So if you want to advance this slide one more time here, Sean, the whole point of using this model is that you come out with scorecards and action plans. So what you can see here is in the upper right-hand corner is an example of a small academic library that used the model to come out with their business planning for how they can move forward with their digital preservation program. The little scorecard sort of in the center left, a Croatian government agency contacted me, ran the scorecard, used it to gain leverage with their stakeholders to say, we don't have what we need. The bottom 2 cards, we used the model with the City of Toronto, and they came out with a plan. So what you see with those arrows is they're saying, in this year, we want to advance from this level of capability in this component, and it's going to take this much time. And the last category, which you probably can't see, was difficulty. So they knew that writing a policy or developing a strategy was different than going after software or building technical expertise. But they were able to look at all those components and create a 5-year plan of how they were going to advance. In 2015, Preservica and Charles and I wrote a white paper together, and Preservica took the self-assessment model, not as an organization, but simply on the technology side, and basically demonstrated that even without policy and strategy, if you have a technology that can help you preserve, you can move up the scale of capability. And then we were honored to have a member of the United Nations sit in on a workshop we did for ICA, and he mentioned us in this report that he did in Records and Archives Management in the United Nations. So it's a tool like many other tools, and I'll also be providing other assessment tools that you can use, and hopefully it will help you in building your business case. Okay, moving forward here. So I want to hear from some others. So once you have articulated the value, you have identified some of your risk, you know where you have gaps in your capability. Of course, another part of the business planning and business process is to go out and gain support. And so we know that will be leadership, your reporting structure, the folks that have the budget dollars, information technology, will need to probably support you getting content from inside the organization into the repository. Other folks who are involved in the appraisal, who are stakeholders who have specialized expertise, maybe in metadata or other things. And of course, your users and the folks that ultimately want access to your collections need to be in the mix. And all those folks come together to help you build the case for building out your digital archive. Okay, so that's the end of my section. And there is a template that Preservica has put together. If you have a business planning process in your organization, you probably will have to use their template. But this is very useful, gives you some examples, lots of examples of business drivers. And then those resources, the DVAR calculator and other things are in the back there. So we'll also give you a link to this resource so you can take advantage of it if it's useful to you. Okay, so now it is my pleasure to introduce Kyle Browneth, who is the director for in Library Archives Canada for digital collections, and he's going to share with you what they have learned in their business planning process. So welcome, Kyle. Take it away.
Thank you. I'll just make sure that everything is visible here for you guys, and I'll just hide my face so you can focus on the slides here, but hopefully you can hear my voice. And there we go. Okay. Well, thank you again, Laurie. As you mentioned, we're all in different journeys, and we're talking about, Preservica Starter is one of the key tools. But I'll say that for LAC, we've been using the enterprise solution of Preservica, and so there's some lessons that I can speak to on that side of things. But it's interesting because we've spoken with other organizations, large ones, small ones, all different sizes, and what we found is that although the scale is different, the challenges that we have are consistent. We still have the same challenges, and so hopefully there are some lessons that you can learn from our journey that we took in terms of using Preservica and renewing our digital preservation activities at LAC. So I figured before I talk about the journey that we took, I would give you some context about what is LAC, who are we, and that'll give you a sense of kind of, okay, this is the kind of organization that they are, but also the main challenges that we had, because that really sets the foundation for why we chose Preservica, why we thought it was a good fit for us, because we looked at a lot of different solutions before
Kyle, can I just interrupt? I'm not seeing your slides.
Oh.
So maybe we need to just there we go. Now we see them. Thank you.
Sorry about that. Sorry. There we go. Technology, there you go. It's important. People and processes and tools working together. So, yeah, so in terms of us as an organization, I figured I like showing pictures. So what you can see here on the left is what we call the Gatineau Preservation Center. This is our main digital preservation facility. It's also our main analog preservation facility, but I show that because that's where the magic happens. So when we talk about digital preservation, that's where a lot of it occurs. It's about 20 minutes from Parliament in Ottawa, and it's a great facility, and it's some exciting work that's happening there. So when I talk about the work that we're doing, that's where it happens. But more and more of it is also happening in the cloud with the Preservica team, and I can talk about that as well. Now, the image on the right is our second preservation center. So you can imagine we have a very catchy name for that. We called it G2, which is basically the Gatineau Preservation Center, the second one. So we might not be very good at naming things, but I will say one very cool aspect of this facility is that it's actually the world's largest archival facility for automated storage and retrieval. So inside there's robotic arms to control the accessing of the various boxes for our clients and for staff. So I show that because as we think about using the Preservica software and the activities that we went through to make our processes more efficient on the digital side, we were also thinking about that in a more holistic sense about how can we do this end to end? Because I think what you'll find is when you look at the digital processes, there are some corollaries and some activities that will impact your analog processes as well. So just keep a high level approach as you look at your various workflows. So as we do a little tour of LAC here, this is one of the many vaults we have in the Gatineau Preservation Center. The reason I show this is because our work is never done. There's still a lot of digitization to be done. It's just a very small percentage of our collection that's digitized, but we do have work, as I imagine is the case with many archives and libraries, is that we have work for many decades to come. And so this is something that is an ongoing challenge, but a good challenge for us to have. Now, this is the art vault. And I know what you're thinking. You might be thinking, oh goodness, is this like an Indiana Jones episode where, you know, there's amazing relics and they're never going to be seeing the light of day? I can reassure you that is not the case. I did think that when I first started at LAC, but I actually entered the program that works with museums and galleries from across Canada and internationally to make sure that these portraits are seen by Canadians and many others. So although we do preservation and we do digital scanning in Gatineau, we do make sure that these portraits are made available through museums and galleries. Now that brings us to what I think is probably of most interest to us today, which is the digital collection. And this, for us, goes back to about the 1960s. So we collect records from private donors, from Canadian publishers, but also from the Government of Canada, the federal government. And so we have records, a lot of them on magnetic disc. So we have a lot of different carriers, and I'm sure you can relate to the challenges that come with that, the various different kinds of carriers you have to deal with, and making sure that you migrate from one to another to make sure that you can continue to have access. Now, I can't personally relate to magnetic tape. I think my father had experience with that, although I can relate to Commodore 64. When I was young, I did use the Commodore 64. So that's the challenge we have, is we have so much digital content, and a lot of it is still on physical carriers. So not only is it migrating off the physical carrier, but then it's looking at the data and saying, is this format still accessible to the public? Is it in a format that can even be opened by our clients? And of course, that's one of the key requirements we had in going forward with our renewal. So before I go into the 10 key questions that we had, I'll talk about the main challenge, because like I said, this kind of formulates the rationale for all of that work. And we had a lot of different challenges, but as you can imagine, we're a large organization, but we really focused on the main 3 pain points we had. And for us, these were primarily, number one, ensuring that we were doing best practice digital preservation. Now, we were doing what we felt was a good job in terms of making sure that we were having at least more than one copy being preserved. We had 2 copies, but generally they were in the same geographic location, and we knew that having 3 copies geographically distributed would be even better. So we wanted to make sure that we moved towards that, complementing what we already had on the tape library with additional copies that could be automatically distributed across Canada. Another factor was making sure that although we could do, well, we did integrity checks and we continue to do them on the data tapes, the challenge with that is that it's a bit of a manual process, and we wanted to make sure that for the extra copy that we had, we could do this in a more automated fashion. So that was another requirement we had. In terms of the pre-ingest or bringing content into the archive, that's the second point, which was really that this was a point of pain for us, for our staff, but also for our clients, which was that they would send us content, we would acquire it digitally, but we didn't do the proactive work to make sure that it was in the right metadata format, that it was the right file formats. And so in some cases, we would have backlogs. And I'm sure you can relate to this. Being able to process those backlogs, if you don't get that right information, it can take potentially years. So we wanted to make sure that we could process content more quickly from the point of acquisition right through to ingest. And then finally, we wanted to make sure that when we had content in the archive, we could make it available online through more automated mechanisms. Now, we obviously created access copies for our website, but we knew that that was a fairly manual process, and we thought, how can we make that more efficient? And as you'll see in our journey, that was another point that clients told us very specifically. They said, we need to see more content online. We want to have the archive more available to us on the internet. So we looked at a lot of different questions. As you can imagine, we're a government institution. There's some bureaucracy there. There's a million different pieces of paperwork to complete to make the case for renewal of digital preservation practices and asset management practices. But if I were to boil it down to 10 key questions that hopefully potentially have relevance for you in your journey, regardless of the size of your institution, I'd say these are the 10 key questions that we asked ourselves. And you'll see in that second column, there's a specific activity that relates to answering that question. So I won't go into detail on this slide, but in the following slides, I'll speak to each of these in more detail. So the first question we asked was, what are the main challenges we're facing? And this is very important. Obviously, you want to start with having a good question, and a good question will give you a good answer. If you ask a different question, you'll get a different answer. So this was actually the easiest for us, and it might be the easiest for you because you're starting from having that pain. Usually it's that pain that pushes your organization forward. It might be externally where you're pulling or you're surveying your clients and they're telling you they want more content available online, and that was definitely the case for us. They were telling us every single year, more strongly each year. And we knew that point, but we knew that there was resource challenges. We knew that we couldn't just staff up a huge army of staff to be able to put everything online right away. We knew it was going to take time. So we said, how can we be more efficient with the resources that we had? We needed to kind of strike a balance between people, processes, and tools. And I'll go back to that many times. So for us, that first question, answering it, was very clear. We knew the problems we had, and I spoke to those, and we knew from our clients what those challenges were. But when you get to the second question, what do we want exactly? That's a really important question because you might have pain points, but they don't actually cover the entire problem, or they might be surface level problems and there's actually root causes that are even more important. And so you don't want to make any assumptions, because if you make assumptions, you might get a solution that doesn't really meet your needs. So for us, we did a requirements gathering exercise, and I would obviously strongly recommend this for you too. But going out to your various stakeholders externally to the organization and internally, and asking them, for the work that you do, how could this be better? And when I say what do we want exactly, I'm not talking about any particular solution. I'm just saying in terms of the benefits that you would like to have. So for example, we knew staff, when they were digitally acquiring publications, it was a very manual process. There was a lot of stress and pain in terms of manually copying and pasting between one system and another. The systems not talking to each other. There was a lot of manual effort that was not really appropriate for the level of education that staff had. And they felt that they could be doing much more valuable work for our clients, like doing public outreach about our collection, being more proactive about getting certain acquisitions. So make sure that you go to your various stakeholders and document those requirements. Number 3 would be, how does the solution align with our strategy? This is super important because if you think about making the case, I know Lori was talking about demonstrating value. That was very important to us because although we are a large organization, I think we have the same challenges as many other heritage institutions, which is we don't have unlimited funds to do things. We have limited human resources, limited financial resources, and we compete with other departments that also have needs as well. So we need to say when we want to renew our digital preservation practices, which might not be a priority for the Government of Canada or a priority for a higher level department, we can say, well, this work will support public access, or this work will support what we're trying to do in a broader digital strategy. So this is where we looked at digital strategies of the Government of Canada long term. This is where we looked at strategies that didn't necessarily mention digital preservation, but we would have a long-term strategy for the organization that had commitments that senior management had already made to Canadians, saying, we're going to do these things over the next 5-10 years. And we could say, by renewing our digital preservation practices, we can actually support these access objectives. And so it's very important that when you're making that case, make those links to the existing long-term strategies that you have, because senior management is already basically on the line to deliver on those strategies. You've made it public, you've likely published it on your website, you've told your clients you're going to do this. So anything you can do to support that strategy, I think is going to get the attention of senior managers. The fourth question we asked was, how will we measure success? And this again is a very important question. It's not esoteric at all, because although you might with the first 3 questions be able to acquire something, you're still going to have that challenge of how do you show the benefits? How do you show success? How do you maintain interest? And this is particularly important for any kind of organization, but for us, where we're funded by taxpayers, it's our duty to make sure that we're providing value for Canadians. So you really have to clarify what are the clear outcomes and benefits you want to achieve. Now, for a large organization like us, even for a small organization, you might have like 100 different requirements that you have. So that's a little too much to be able to say, how are you going to measure the benefits? How are you going to communicate them? So you want to clarify that down to maybe, 5 to 10 core benefits, maybe even less than that. For us, I think we had about 5 key benefits, and measure them. So that goes to the 5th question, which is, where are we now? Now, we knew that the main benefit we had, which kind of crossed over a lot of our work, was being more efficient. So having a reduced process time and associated cost with that, of course, because staff is performing the work, a reduced process time for bringing in content, for preserving it, and making it available to our clients. So this is where we said, okay, well, if that's what we want, we need to know where we are. So we benchmarked our processes. This is where we asked the various areas, okay, when you do your work, how long does that usually take? And of course, one person might say one thing, another person says another thing, but ask them all and then take an average. It's better than nothing. And to be able to benchmark your processes of where you're at now, you'll get a sense of how long things take, because there's a cost with everything that you do. And then you can say, okay, now what are our options based on that information? Now, I'll come back to that when we talk about measuring success and showing success, but I'll just leave it at that for now. It was a very important step for us, and I would recommend it if you can do it. So number 6 is, what are our options? Here we looked at all of the different various options, and it's important because as you're making a case to senior management, of course, status quo is always an option, and you don't want to be caught flat-footed where they say, well, what if we just did nothing, and you don't know what to say. So it is important that you say, okay, well, if we didn't improve our digital preservation practices, this is what could happen. We could lose data, and this is what could happen to the data. This is what could happen to the reputation of our organization. This is what could happen to our clients and their ability to do their work, depending on the information that you have in your archive. So there are so many consequences of lost data. It just ripples outwards. So you really want to make that really clear to your stakeholders that this is the real cost. It's not just data is lost, but what does that mean for your clients? What does that mean for your staff and your senior managers? Make it real for them. So that's important. And then when you're looking at that, you want to look at what are the various options. So not only status quo, but what if you were to build a solution in-house? So you know your requirements, but would you be able to do this yourself? And we knew from past experience that there was just so much complexity in what we wanted as a solution that we just did not have the resources internally to do it ourselves. And of course, you want to leave yourself open to various open source or commercial solutions. We didn't limit ourselves there. We just said to the community, here's our requirements, show us what's available. And that goes to the 7th question. So what solutions are available? Now for us, being the federal government, it's bureaucratic. There's various steps we have. It might be different for you, but we have something called a request for information process, an RFI process, where we basically go out to the community internationally. There's no preference for any particular country, and we say, what solutions are available based on our general needs that we know? And then they came back to us. I think we had 26 different institutions that came back to us. And then we said, okay, now we have a better understanding of what's available and what our specific requirements are. And we go back to them through a request for proposals process. And this is where we have a list of vendors, and then we narrow it down. So number 8, the question we had was, who needs to be involved? This is a very important question, and I would give this a lot of thought for yourself, because the worst is that you have a stakeholder that you have brought in a new solution and you find out they had a requirement that was very important and they weren't informed about the solution, and so they think it's a very bad idea, or they want something else that's counter to what the rest of the organization wants. So there's a lot of conflict that you can avoid by making sure that you identify all your stakeholders up front. It's good project management practice, but I'd say any kind of change you're making to your organization, you want to make sure that all the stakeholders that are impacted are involved. It's kind of the really good change management practice, because as you bring in new technology, of course, that's going to impact your people and your processes. And so stakeholders, you need to know who's involved. And I'll say, don't make any assumptions. Don't assume that it's just you understanding who the stakeholders are. Ask others. How can we measure results quickly? So this is where I would say iteration planning is super important. Make sure that you do things not all at once. And you want to make sure that you can show results on a regular basis. For us, that was every 3 months. And that goes to our governance structure, which is question 10. How often and how will we share to stay on track? We made sure that we had a meeting every 3 months so we could share the benefits and the work that we were doing in the test results. So that kind of shows this image here where we had the user stories and the benefits that our clients wanted, and we could show on a 3-month basis, here's for a certain workflow, the value that's being generated for our clients. And we found that that worked very well. So just some parting thoughts as I close off. I'll say 3 key things to keep in mind. There's so much to keep in mind, and I'm excited for the Q&A later on, but number 1, secure strong sponsorship throughout. It's so important, and I'd say that's even more important than the project management component of bringing in new technology. You want to have a strong sponsor at the executive level that can champion support for the project and keep it, keep the other stakeholders involved and engaged. Number 2, you want to deliver client and employee value in iterations. And so this is where you can show progress and value on a regular basis. Don't wait on an annual basis, because as we were talking about financial cycles, that's a little too late. You need to show value before you ask for more money. And then finally, yes, of course, measure results, but celebrate the wins and communicate them. And I say that because even if you bring in new technology, it's the people on your team that are going to be using that tool that are going to make the benefits real. And it's the people at Preservica that make the software that benefits your clients. So at the end of the day, it's all people. And you want to make sure that they are celebrated for the work that they're doing to improve their processes, to work with other stakeholders, to engage them in the process, and to really serve your clients. So I'll leave it at that, and I'll pass it back to Lori.
Thank you, Kyle. That was great. I have a couple of questions lined up for you when we get to that segment. So thank you so much for sharing that. It's very straightforward. And I can only imagine the amount of work that went into that to bring it into reality. So we'll hear more from you in the Q&A. So thank you very much. So now I want to take a few minutes and show you something in the starter system that Paul wants to focus on. As I said, this is a recording session. Paul's not with us in person today, but Aubrey is. And go ahead, Sean, to the next slide. So Paul touched on in the previous sessions the capability of Starter to make your assets accessible via the integrated public portal. There's a private public switch in there. And of course, now you've heard from Kyle, and I know from my experience too, that when the people that give you content are able to see their content readily, it gets them motivated and excited. And of course, there are other folks who didn't know you had these assets. So the access side is very important, but in the archives and records community, of course, that's also a very important point of control. So let's turn it over to the video from Paul, and then Aubrey will come back to highlight a few things at the end. So stay tuned. Thank you.
Just to sort of recap a little bit, firstly, on what we covered in session 2, if you were able to attend that. So we really got into getting content into Starter via the various methods, how we can sort of drill down, look at the information about our preserved assets, understanding more about adding metadata to our content, getting content in bulk, so using the bulk upload feature and bulk edit feature, and we sort of touched on making your content publicly accessible. So this short session is really going to be drilling down into that particular section and looking at, again, or reminding ourselves around the private and public settings options, using a good folder structure to make it simple to navigate through the content, how you can change thumbnail appearance to improve the UI and user experience, and also that importance of metadata to help searching for content. And also, if I get a chance, I'll just show you a quick couple of example customer access portal sites at the end as well. So I'm going to switch over to my screen, and hopefully you're seeing that. So I'm going to log into my starter system. So as I say, in session 2, I showed you how we could get content in, and I put all that content into this folder here, the ALA RMS training folder. That content is still there, still in my starter system. Okay, the folder is currently set to private, and all the subfolders and assets within that are set to private. And that's the default setting for all content that you upload into Starter. So that means it's only visible to the user in Starter itself. So if we want to make our content visible, we need to change that setting. So we can do that at each level, folder, subfolder, and asset level. So if I want to do it at my top folder level, all I need to do is right click. And here you can see my current setting is set to private. I just simply switch that to public. Okay, and that will then filter through to my subfolders and my assets. Okay, and we'll see that once that's completed, we'll have a little blue banner against our folder to indicate that that is now a public folder. Likewise, when I click into there, my 3 subfolders are showing the same as well. And when I click into a folder that contains some assets, we can see again that a slightly different icon to indicate that those assets are all public as well. Okay, so if I then choose to have a look at one of these assets, so let's choose one that had some good metadata in. So we'll go into the bulk upload, and if I choose, say, this campus building asset here. So when I click on there, obviously I can see the details of the asset here, the metadata, and I have this option here that says view public. Okay, so I can click on that, and that then opens up that asset in my access portal. Okay, so I'm drilling down into that specific asset. Okay, now within here I can see, view the image itself, view the asset. I've got my metadata that was uploaded as part of that. And across the top here, I've got my options to share that content via social media, via email, to download the access representation of that asset. I can like it as well. And I've also got that path showing me that folder structure leading to that asset in my Starter system. Okay. Now, if I go back, and so I can actually sort of go back through that structure here in that path. So I can go back through, I can see my subfolder structure here, and I can go back to my sort of top level folder here to see my 3 top level folders, and ultimately I can go to Browse Archive and see my ultimate top level folders that I'm sharing in Starter. Now, if I go back into Starter and say, actually, what I want to do is change some of this. Okay, so I don't want to make everything public. I want to have a mixture of public and private. So this is where you've got to be a little bit careful in terms of when you're creating your folder structures and choosing what to make public and private. Having that mixture of public and private settings across your folders, subfolders, and assets can make it sometimes difficult to find that content through the same structure in Starter. So that's a consideration that you need to think about. So for example, if I go back to my folder 3 here, and if I right click and let's say I'm going to make that subfolder private. Okay, so the top level folder is still public. These 2 subfolders are public. I've chosen to make that subfolder private, and therefore what will happen is the content within that will also become private. And we can see that that banner is removed. If I drill down into there, my 3 assets now no longer have that icon to indicate that they are public as well. But let's say I do still want to keep my campus building as public. So I can again right click on that and choose that that asset is still public. Okay, and that updates quickly to see that that is now public. So now if I click into there and go to my view public option again, open up my public access portal, great, I can see that as I could before. But notice now the sort of the breadcrumbs, the file path here is kind of a little bit different in terms of I can see the asset, but I can't see the subfolder that content is derived from. Okay, so I can still go back to my home page, or I can click on Browse Archive to sort of drill down through my content. Okay, and if I choose my top folder here, drill down into that, I'm only seeing those 2 subfolders that are public. Okay, so again, it's kind of really just reminding you around having that mixture of settings and how that can influence how that information is displayed. Okay, so just something to bear in mind when structuring your content. Okay, so let's now move on and talk about thumbnails and the appearance of thumbnails. So again, within Starter, we can see when I go into my folders, I don't have any thumbnails set up at folder level, but I do when I drill down into my assets, I can see thumbnails that are derived here, and they appear within my collections here as well. Okay, but that's not always the case. Okay, so the thumbnails are generated automatically in Starter based on the file format of the asset that it's derived from. But I've got an example here in my folder 1 where I've got a sound file, an audio file, okay, which is public, and that doesn't have a thumbnail generated because it's a sound file. It doesn't have an image associated with it. Okay, so if we then look in Starter at that asset, we can see that we still have a thumbnail, but it's not using a thumbnail generated from the asset. It's using like a default icon, okay, which in some cases may be okay. But again, if you really want to have a good user experience and a UI effect for people visiting your site, you may want to change that thumbnail. And you can do that at both, again, asset and folder level. And that's, again, very simple. We can right click and we have an option that says change thumbnail. Okay, so when I click on that, we can see that at the moment there is no thumbnail. I can click on choose file. It gives you the options here about the types of format and the size. I can click on choose file and I can then navigate to where that content is. And I've already got a prepared sound thumbnail that I'm going to use. I'm going to select that and I'm going to click on change. Okay, so that's going to update my thumbnail in Starter. So we can see that thumbnail applied here. And if I go back into here and refresh, I might have to do a Shift and F5 to properly refresh my site for that to then come through. So I can now see that that thumbnail has updated in Starter as well. Okay, and we can also do that at folder level. So again, if I switch back, going up to my folder, let's go to our very top level folder. Notice that in Starter, we don't see the folder thumbnails in here directly. But if I go back to my home page in Starter, we do have thumbnails here, which again, at the moment, I just have that default folder icon. So if I want to, again, improve that, I can right click, change the thumbnail, again, choose a file. And this time I've got like a training icon that I'm going to use. I'm going to upload that. Again, that will change the thumbnail. We don't see that thumbnail, as I say, in Starter, but back into Starter, the Access portal, I can refresh, and again, we can see that, again, visually more appealing. So that's how we can change the thumbnail display to improve that in the portal. Okay, so let me show you a couple of real-life example sites. You can view the full selection here. So let's start with Stockton University Digital Collection. So this site has been customized with a logo, backdrop and text, but we can see a nice simple top level folder structure. And if we drill down into one of these folders, a nice structured chronological order to the folders with a good use of thumbnails. Let's have a look at another one. So Santa Barbara Historical Museum Digital Archive. So again, a bit of customization, but also a really nicely organized top level folder structure with a great use of thumbnails. So if we drill down into, say, moving images, we then see another simple subfolder structure with a good use of thumbnails and folder descriptions. If we select one of these assets, for example, video, we can then see just a single asset but we have, again, a nice use of basic descriptive metadata in there. But if I then drill down into that asset, we can see we've also got some nicely completed Dublin core metadata as well, which is going to help users find out more information about the asset, but also find that asset using the search functions. So here we can see some nicely completed typical examples of some starter public access sites. Feel free to take a look at a few more like this on the starter public access showcase site. Thanks.
Okay, great. Hopefully that was useful to you if you've been playing around with Starter to make sure you understand how the public-private toggle works. And then I think it's fun if you can customize the thumbnail. So Aubrey, can you take us through a couple of slides here, just summarizing what Paul covered?
Yeah, absolutely. So most of this he covered, so I'll just go over things really quickly. The public and private settings, they give you that control over who can and cannot access your assets. So be sure to utilize them where applicable and follow those instructions to make sure that if they are public, as he was showing in there, that users can actually find them in your portal. It's really important. Folder structure is also very important, which I'm sure you all know. Just make sure to follow those best practices in terms of naming and structuring those collections so that users can find them easily. And I think thumbnails is a really important thing. I know that he covered it pretty extensively, but just work really hard to find the most eye-catching or representative asset in your folder to choose as a thumbnail. That's going to really help researchers, and it can also help you in the back end if you're looking through. If you got those eye-catching images, you know, oh, that's the collection I'm looking for. It's just going to make things a little bit more seamless. And then lastly, metadata is essential. I am big into metadata. If you want your documents to be discoverable in Starter, definitely ensure that they have good metadata attached to them, especially if your documents don't have OCR, if your PDFs aren't OCR, the metadata is going to be of the utmost importance there. And then the next slide, I think, just covers those public access showcases. Those are a couple of really good examples, but we've got a ton more on there. City of Milwaukee is fantastic. Buena Vista University, also a great one to check out. So be sure to take a look at those public access showcases. We'll have a link for that for you as well. And then the last one. So this is covering Google Analytics, which is a Starter Plus functionality. But if you do upgrade to Starter Plus, that is going to come with Google Analytics at no cost. So you'll be able to utilize this fantastic asset to see what people are looking at in your collection, see what your researchers are interested in, and provide these kind of reports to your stakeholders, which is just going to show the value of your collection. So it's a super important addition there. Again, that is a Starter Plus, as well as the portal branding is also Starter Plus. So those are upgrades, but if you do upgrade, they're definitely worth taking full advantage of.
Thanks, Aubrey.
Mm-hmm.
Okay, and now it's my pleasure to introduce Rachel Onuff, who's Director of Historical Records Program at the Vermont State Records and Archives Administration. And she's got a really interesting use case for using Starter. So, hi, Rachel.
Hey, Lori. Hello, everybody. Let me go ahead and share my screen. Unless what happens to Kyle happens to me. Well, I can't see my screen. Can you?
Yes, we can see your screen. There we go.
Okay, great. Wonderful. Well, good afternoon all. I'm thrilled to be speaking to you this afternoon. Thanks, Lori, for the invitation. I'm going to tell you a little bit about what I've been doing in Vermont to try to, forgive the pun, startering conversations about digital preservation and access for various historical records repositories and for citizen-led documentation projects. This image is from one of our collections in our digital repository, which I will tell you more about in a bit. Sean, I might have to have you advance my slides. I'm not able, seem to be able to do it. Well, while we wait for that, I can tell you a little bit about the Vermont Historical Records Program. We are based at the Vermont Historical Records, Vermont State Archives and Records Administration, and are a program of the Vermont Historical Records Advisory Board. Every state in the United States has a board, and they are eligible for federal funding from the NHPRC, exclusively available to state boards, which is how we've funded our program to date. We started in 2017 with some seed money from our Secretary of State, which is where our state archives resides, is within the Secretary of State's office, which is one of the ways that archives are placed within U.S. systems. There's different places where they might sit within state government. The first thing I did was write a grant and got some more funding to make a full-time position. That is now 2 full-time positions. We are fully funded by the state of Vermont and are using state board funds to expand the programs that we're able to provide. The things we do are provide technical assistance. Here we go, technical assistance to historical records repositories around the state through site visits and workshops and other trainings. All of those initially were in person, but during the pandemic, we shifted to offering virtual as well. And that's been really successful and has allowed us, as many of you have probably experienced, to expand our reach and what people we are able to work with. There's still a great hunger for in-person interactions. So we've been real busy this summer getting out and about again, both to do workshops and to get on site. That's one thing we do. The other larger piece is to try to build up infrastructure and capacity statewide. We're a really small state. We have a population of maybe 635,000 people. That said, we have maybe 198 different historical records repositories, and that's not including the town clerk's offices. That's just the historical societies and local museums. Another thing that our program does is encourages civic engagement by supporting citizen-led documentation projects, and I'll tell you some more about that as well. My colleague Sally, who works with me as the roving archivist for the VHRP, is working toward her digital archive specialist certificate through the Society of American Archivists to beef up what we're able to provide in the digital realm for a lot of our stakeholders. But we also offer a lot of research advice and other work with them and then with individuals. And this program was started because there was a gap that the state archivist had identified. VSARA, the Vermont State Archives and Records Administration, is focused on the records of state government, state agencies. The Vermont Historical Society was more focused on artifacts. They didn't have a trained archivist. They had a wonderful librarian, but not an archivist on staff. So there was a need for the folks who have historical records in their care to have someone to turn to with the questions and to get support. So that's where our program sits, is kind of betwixt and between these organizations that were already existing and who we collaborate with in all sorts of ways. Next slide, please. So I thought maybe it would be helpful to give some more context, not only about the VHRP, but about the different communities in Vermont. We have many small historical societies and museums and community archives, as I mentioned, tend to be all volunteer. They also tend to be digitizing, some of them significant amount of digitization, but typically it's because they're posting on Facebook or using other social media, but mostly Facebook, sometimes for access, but mostly for their website or for other social media. The mid-sized repositories have some institutional capacity, but it may be a full-time or a part-time professional staff member, and very rarely is that person just tasked with archival duties. they often already have a significant quantity of digitized content and have some born digital materials that are sitting in the cloud or on their own hard drives, kind of awaiting obsolescence as I look at them. And then there's really only, I call them the gorillas, the three big gorillas. That would be the State Archives, the State Historical Society, and then the Vermont Folklife Center that I will mention again in a bit. They have full-time professional staff members fulfilling archival duties and provide access to digital content from their own repositories. And in some cases, like the VHS, they host materials that are owned by other organizations as well. They have put up an Omeka site a few years ago and tested out whether they could serve digital assets that belong to small historical societies. And their finding was that it was a ton of work to provide the type of metadata that they thought would be appropriate at very high standards, being librarians, for what they thought needed to be included with those assets. So that project kind of paused at that stage. And we do have the University of Vermont and some colleges, although it seems like there are fewer every year, either because they go out of business or they consolidate. And they do have some part-time or full-time professional staff. And none of them, including UVM, are doing a whole lot in terms of the management of born digital institutional records, but they're very aware of the need to address that. And I see this as a potential space for VHRP to really try to help out, and an opportunity to use Starter as a way into those conversations. Next slide, please. So in all of this, Starter is really a catalyst with all of these communities talking about preservation and access. One thing I've had to recognize is it's been a really slow process, and it's going to continue to be. Everyone has limited bandwidth for thinking about and coming up with good solutions for digital preservation for their wonderful assets. No one questions the value of what they have and the importance of making a case for its long-term preservation. Personally, I've just tried to recognize that I need to be patient and that this is an iterative process, and that everything that we do with the VHRP, because the work we do around digital preservation and around digitization is only one aspect of it, but that it's all connected. So whether we're giving an inventorying or a cataloging workshop or a grant writing workshop or disaster preparedness hands-on training, this is all of a piece, and it's all helping to build up our community and all helping to help move us forward. But absolutely, I'm well aware that digital preservation is a really important part of that. Next slide, please. So some specific strategies that we've been adopting to engage and educate these specific communities about digital preservation and access. And it's different for some of them. So for the smaller repositories, we are using some of our program funding to buy equipment, and we'll get a mobile scanning unit out later this summer, try going out on the road. I had some experience with this when I worked down in Massachusetts and we had community scanning days. So we'll have scanners and a camera set up as well. And kind of using the carrot of, we'll bring our equipment, we'll help train you how to use it. As many people as can come scan like crazy, but we're also going to introduce you to the idea of doing some description, and here's some best practice guidelines for what fields you might want to fill in. And where might you put these things that you have now digitized, and not just keep them on your computer. So it's a wonderful to have Starter to introduce them to, because they need a place to put stuff. And it's for me, it's been wonderful to have that as an option to provide to people, to say you don't just keep them on your hard drive anymore, and you can make them more available as well as preserve them. So the handful of medium-sized repositories in the state, I did a survey, a really quick and dirty one, just to kind of assess digital readiness and willingness to be part of a consortial solution to digital preservation needs. And that has informed some of the work going forward. And And I've brought in NEDCC to also help develop a report, and I've shared those findings from that survey with them. I've worked with some institutions to help develop grant proposals. Most notably, the Sheldon Museum in Middlebury received a preservation assistance grant from the National Endowment for the Humanities, and it was the first one ever to, instead of for a traditional preservation project, to use the funding for an ongoing digital preservation assessment and consultancy with NEDCC that really helped them take an initial preservation assessment they'd had done for their digital assets and actually start to try to implement some of those recommendations the consultant had made. And I did run some starter beta tester meetings during the pandemic, kind of browbeat 5 or 6 of my colleagues at different repositories into trying it, starter out when it was in beta, and to talk about what would work and what would not work, and what they thought of it. And it was great, again, for community building and awareness around not only existence of starter as a solution, but of awareness of the need to preserve things. And the bigger repositories, and this would be VISARA, represented by VHRP, the Vermont Historical Society, and the Department of Libraries. We received funding for a planning grant for a statewide digital repository. And that has been, the focus is very much on access. And I see my role on that committee mostly to kind of continue to make the call for a need for a system that would either include digital preservation within its functionality, or be able to run in parallel with some sort of digital preservation system. So that's an ongoing grant that's supposed to close out at the end of this year, with the intention of then seeking some funds for implementation. In the meantime, we do have a Digital Public Library of America Access Hub. We pay a bunch of money for every year. We don't see a whole lot of return on investment for it. So we've been thinking about what to do about that, and whether we continue to maintain that, or if that does eventually get folded into whatever we build. And as I said before, there's this real opportunity to raise awareness of the need for preservation actions for born digital materials. And certainly I've seen the light bulb go off in various people's eyes when I talk about Preservica's ability to render obsolete formats. And I think that's just a tremendous asset to have within a system. And it's not so relevant for the smaller places, because their digital assets are almost exclusively materials, they're analog materials that they have digitized. So they're in formats that are easy to render right now. So they're not as concerned about those issues. Next slide, please. But in all cases, there's other strategies that are important no matter what community I'm working with. And as I've been saying, people really do prioritize access over preservation. So I'm making the argument whenever possible that that's wonderful. Yes, access, absolutely. How can we ensure that access will continue to be there? We must preserve things for the long term in order to make sure they remain accessible. And bringing in the experts helps. I can talk about digital preservation, but having someone from the Northeast Document Conservation Center come in and lead a series of facilitated discussions and offer some basic information about risks, raising people's awareness of what their files might be facing in the near term, has been really helpful. We did that in June. And again, we had some funding from the grant in order to be able to do that. One thing I've learned in my time here, as I said, came up from Massachusetts, which has this wonderful statewide consortial digital repository, digital commonwealth. I kind of thought that I wanted to come up here and build the same thing for Vermont, but I've realized that one model is not going to suit everyone. And Vermont is, we don't have counties, we have municipalities, and there's all these tiny little silos and tiny little societies and museums, and a lot of them are going to do it their own way and want to. So I've kind of backed down from that idea that there's going to be a single place where they all want to go. I still love the idea of standing up some sort of consortial model, but I'm also all in on supporting organizations that want to stand up their own starter instances. So that's been good to do. And we use our own instance as a model, and that's basically why it exists, because next slide, please. VHRP does not have any collections of its own. And so what we have is quite diverse and idiosyncratic because it's been pretty reactive. It's what we've been able to get by being opportunistic, I suppose you could say. So they've all come in different ways in terms of how they've been gathered, what kind of content they have, and how the metadata has been developed. So next slide, please. The first one I want to talk to you about is an example of repository-led crowdsourcing project. The Vermont Folklife Center, shortly after the inauguration, put out a call saying they wanted to collect everyone's favorite Bernie memes, thinking that they might get a few people sending them some memes. But I think largely because Neil Gaiman picked up and retweeted their tweet, it ended up going fairly viral, like the mittens themselves, and they had over 1,000 different memes sent in. So the archivist was kind of throwing up his hands, not sure what he would do with all of these. He did decide very laboriously while sitting in front of the television at night to rename them all and save them as PDFs. But then I persuaded him to let us have access to the Google Drive, and we've been putting them up into Starter. So all the memes are there. We have added no additional metadata other than the titles because he did a fairly good job of creating categories and identifying keywords and using those in the titles. Next slide, please. So for instance, there are 27 hits for Canada, including this one, which was contributed by the Canadian Forces Museum of Aerospace Defense. And they had just created that independently and then seen the invitation to share. The other, another kind of project that we use our starter for is to gather citizen-led documentation projects. The first one started during COVID-19 when professional photographers reached out wanting to preserve the photographs they were taking of people in their neighborhoods. And one of them also had his subjects fill out a questionnaire that really captures in a snapshot what they were feeling at that point in March of 2020. So and he was also, the other good thing about that is that that form also served as a release form. So we have the forms, the photographs, his were black and white, the other photographer worked in color. And there's more photos out there that we could gather. And again, that's one of those projects awaiting a next wave. The other one came up, again, things always seem to bring other things. So we did the state archivist and I did a show for, we were on the local news and someone saw that and then reached out. He's a shape note singer interested in researching how singing builds community and how it did so in the early years of Vermont, and has been gathering information about all of the manuscript and published tune books that exist and that might have been used in Vermont. So working with him and different repositories to get their copies, so that we have 2 from the Vermont Historical Society up already, and they provided the metadata from their OPAC records, but they were willing to allow, because they weren't going to put those up anywhere anytime soon, they were fine with having those up in our starter. Next slide, please. Another thing is I host a home movie day, usually in October. I love that event. And out of the woodwork, from seeing the promotion for that, a man named Mr. Cerulli reached out, and he had already digitized a number of his family's movies from the late 60s, early 70s. So he shared the links with me, and he created some pretty granular metadata identifying who was represented and where they were. So those have been added to Starter as well. Next slide, please. And in the future, the near future, like tomorrow, I'm working on getting more proactive. As I said, so far, we've just been putting up things that have come to us or been made obviously available. And it's wonderful to have something up to show when I do demo starter to repositories or at trainings. But I'm also trying to, I'd like to build it up more as its own, in its own right. So there's a project that was started in the mid-90s that is preserving the historic painted scenery through stage curtains that were created initially from 1890s to 1940s, and so far over 190 in Vermont have been preserved, and they've documented another 300 in New Hampshire and Maine, and are now looking across the whole country. I'm wondering how many there might be up in Ontario, if not in elsewhere in the provinces. But they go and they document, do an inventory first, and then they actually restore the curtains and help hang them up if there's a space to do so. There's been a beautiful book made. So I reached out to the director, who I know is thinking of passing the baton, and I'm going to meet with her tomorrow to talk more about her records, her documentation of all these projects. And that's another thing, is that she wanted to meet in person, and it's still important, even when talking about digital files that are going to be put in a digital repository. She still really wanted to be to show them to me in person. So we're going to meet up and do that tomorrow. Next slide, please. That's all I've got. I'm looking forward to the little time we have for questions, and thanks very much.
Thanks, Rachel. That's such fun stuff. So because we're short on time, I do want to ask Kyle, there was a question about someone interested in the workflow diagram and whether that's something that's publicly available.
Yeah, absolutely. Just reach out to me. Hopefully you have my contact information. If not, it's my name, kyle.brownis@canada.ca, and I'll be happy to share that with you.
Okay, we'll make sure to add that to what's on the community hub so people have access to it. I had a quick question for you, Kyle, which is, you talked about a 3-month cycle of updating your stakeholders. Have you continued that? I mean, was that for a period of time building up the capacity, or is it something that you've continued on?
We have continued that, and we found that that was very useful because, it actually, because we were procuring software that was, as we call it, commercial off the shelf, the rollout period was very quick in terms of getting it into the hands of staff to be able to use. So that was nice. But we wanted to be able to maintain the momentum so that we could show that, we were taking the long game where we knew there was going to be workflows that would take a couple of years to implement. So we kept meeting on every 3 months for a number of years so that we could basically show the value for the various stakeholders, because our organization is also pretty diverse. We've got the library side and the archival side, and they are quite different. There are some similarities, but there are many differences. So we wanted to show that there are benefits to both sides, and there's benefits for the various content that we have, and we found it worked really well. So just food for thought. It's good to keep that momentum going even after you have the tools in place.
Yeah, that's great. And Rachel, I had a question. I thought that your point about leveraging the fact of being able to access obsolete formats. I've seen from other starter users that calling something out of legacy, or they've talked to somebody who can't get a file to render again, has been a really powerful motivator for that. So I wonder if you just want to touch on that point again, how the light bulb goes off, or where that really can help drive people's awareness of preservation versus access.
Yeah, absolutely. I think it's partly been in conversations, largely been in conversations with my friends and colleagues at the University of Vermont, but recognizing that there are, and even in their own work, that they've used programs and applications that no longer can be rendered. They know they have floppy disks in their archives, very carefully enumerated on the finding aid as series 5 electronic media, and that they really need to get those out and try to find a drive they can pop them into to find out. Again, there's just so many steps there to find out what the file type might be, but the idea that there would be this place that you could preserve that original format and render it in something that would be legible to you, as even a preliminary step to providing research access to it, is something that's yeah, I think that's where I've got to just keep pushing. And again, part of my next, one of the other things I want to add to Starter, and I had started it and then made them private, is to put up a bunch of obsolete formats and show how they render.
Oh, that's great. That's
Yep.
really great. Being mindful of time, I'm going to move ahead, first of all, to express our gratitude for your participation and for you sharing your experience and guidance. It's so useful. So just a couple slides here at the end, which is to enable you to access the DVAR tool. So we showed you DVAR tool. There's a business case template you might want to use. And then, of course, we've been trying to make the case that whether you use Starter for a week or a year, it can be very useful in demonstrating not only what digital preservation technology is all about, but also how to connect your users and drive that engagement and motivation and excitement about access to archival collections. The next slide is just how you can, if you wanted to use the digital preservation assessment that Charles and I built. DigitalOK.org is a free site. The data goes nowhere. It will render a scorecard. This report that you see, COSA has done their 3rd series of self-assessments using that model, and they have a report about the outcome. I just wanted to point out this quote, which is that technical infrastructure and services are, obviously a huge area. If you have a digital repository, you can process this stuff and pop it out to an online site. That's really huge, but there's a lot of work to be done, as Kyle and Rachel have enumerated, that you don't need to buy technology to do. There's much work to be done in bringing stakeholders together, to articulating what the vision is, to putting limitations around what you will do, and so there's much to be done that's not technology driven. And so I welcome you to check out the COSA report and learn from them. And with that, I will close it out and say that I very much hope that we will see you again on our final session on August 18th, where we'll talk a little bit more about what the heck is coming in the future and how maybe we can support your case. So I will thank you all for your time and hopefully see you on the 18th. Cheers, take care.